He said they now believe the son-in-law may be the prime suspect. Those are the words. And I recall specifically a lot of language saying Ed Smart is likely the prime suspect here. It's the way it works.
90% of the time, yeah, exactly. That's who it is.
A veteran reporter breaks an exclusive naming a family member as the prime suspect. In the same breath, she brings up the one case where that exact kind of reporting was proven catastrophically wrong. 3 weeks later, the sheriff himself has to publicly beg the media to stop. And a completely unrelated man, who had never met Nancy Guthrie, ends up living the consequences. Here's the full timeline of what that report actually did. I'm Marcus Wren, the creator of the Tell Index, a framework for analyzing statements and behavior in criminal cases. Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of Today co-anchor Savannah Guthrie, disappeared from her Tucson, Arizona home on February 1st, 2026. On February 3rd, just 2 days in, veteran journalist Ashley Banfield reported on her own YouTube show, Drop Dead Serious, that a law enforcement source had named Nancy's son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, as a possible prime suspect. The next day, she went on The Megyn Kelly Show to explain the reporting in more detail. Today's video follows that claim from the moment it was made through to what actually happened to it over the following weeks, using Banfield's original segment, her interview the next day, and the public record that followed. Hit subscribe if you want to see more analysis like this. The claim that would define the next 2 weeks of coverage came from Banfield's own show, a day before the interview analyzed in most of the rest of this video.
But they have towed Annie Guthrie's car. And there is some connection to Annie Guthrie's car and Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law. That would be Annie's husband, Tommaso Cioni, age 50, from Tucson, Arizona, married to Annie P. Guthrie, Savannah's sister. And my law enforcement source tells me that Tommaso Cioni is the prime suspect in this case. Again, law enforcement source tells me that Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law, married to Annie Guthrie, Savannah's sister, is maybe a prime suspect in this case. At the very least, let me tamp that down, because sometimes it's the first person you're looking at, not prime as in there's no one else. Okay, so let's be really mindful of that.
Notice the sequence across less than 60 seconds of her own broadcast. A flat claim is the prime suspect. Immediately softened to maybe, and then, without any pushback from anyone else in the room, a third, explicit self-correction. Let me tamp that down. This isn't a case of a reporter being confronted with the risk of her own claim after the fact. Banfield identifies the risk herself in real time inside the same segment where she's making the claim. That doesn't make the underlying source information false, but it does mean the most aggressive version of the claim, prime suspect, stated flatly, survived for only a few seconds before its own author qualified it twice. Cross-checking this against the case file, within roughly 24 hours, the claim had already outpaced what law enforcement was willing to confirm publicly. Per Fox News' February 5th report, Sheriff Chris Nanos told reporters that there were no suspects or persons of interest in the case at all. Not a softer version of Banfield's claim, but a direct contradiction of it at the level of basic terminology, arriving less than a full day after Banfield had already qualified her own claim twice on air. The Elizabeth Smart parallel wasn't a one-off caveat mentioned once and dropped. Across her own show and the interview the next day, Banfield returns to it 3 times.
Families are always looked at first as well. It doesn't mean right away. Listen, Ed Smart was targeted for weeks as, without question, somebody they needed to look at. Possible suspect, right? Heartbreaking for Ed and Lois Smart, because it wasn't them who took Elizabeth, right? And I'm very mindful. I covered the Elizabeth Smart case. I was out in Salt Lake City for 5 weeks while Elizabeth Smart had vanished. And I recall specifically a lot of language saying Ed Smart is likely the prime suspect here. And so you got to be really mindful that, as you know, Megan, you're a lawyer. Family members are always number one. Like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, Ed Smart. Ed Smart was like one of the number one, suspects in the disappearance of his daughter, Elizabeth. Because does the boogeyman really come into your house and steal your daughter out of her bed beside her little sister? I doubt it. Well, he did. The boogeyman did come in. Brian David Mitchell did come in and steal Elizabeth, and it wasn't Ed Smart.
3 separate invocations of the same cautionary case across 2 broadcasts a day apart rules out the possibility that this was a passing thought Banfield mentioned once and moved past. She kept returning to it, which means the risk wasn't hidden from her or discovered later. It was named by her in real time, repeatedly, while she continued advancing a structurally similar claim about a different family.
Police investigations start in the middle of the circle, and they go out in concentric circles in terms of investigating family members, right? You start in the middle of the family, you investigate out from there. Then you go to contractors and friends and workers and everybody else who's had some contact, and then there's the randoms. So it is not surprising that someone in the family is being looked at. That language to me was pretty strident, though.
Cross-checking this against the case file, the general principle Banfield describes, that investigators routinely look hardest at the people closest to a victim first, is accurate and matches figures cited elsewhere in this case's own coverage. Forensic psychologist Dr. Gary Brucato, on a separate live stream, cited research showing roughly 92% of female murder victims are killed by someone they knew. But Banfield's own instinct that prime suspect was stronger language than the process itself would justify turned out to be the more accurate read, and her own show contains a 4th data point supporting that instinct. Discussing the towed car with Brian Enton later in the same February 3rd episode, she says plainly, "If this ends up being prime suspect, but not the only one, and we're just eliminating him, that could definitely be the case. But I also feel like, would you tow and impound the car if there weren't something bigger to it?" She is, in effect, arguing both sides of her own claim inside a single broadcast. Later in the same interview, Banfield raises a specific physical detail, and then argues against her own theory using it.
They must have ruled out the family pretty quickly if this is a case of forced entry, because the family wouldn't need to do that. The family would presumably have a key, and if they didn't have a key and they wanted to get in, they'd just knock on the door and Nancy Guthrie would open it.
This is a genuinely strong piece of logic, and it directly undercuts the prime suspect framing rather than supporting it. Forced entry as a modus operandi is far more consistent with an offender who does not have routine access to the home than with a family member who visits regularly and would reasonably be let in or have a key. Banfield raises this herself in the same conversation where she's reporting the son-in-law claim, meaning the interview contains its own internal counter-evidence to the headline it generated.
I watched it.
The sheriff, yeah. And I specifically said, so are you telling me, when you said that she did not walk out of that house on her own, I said, are you telling me that she might have been carried out of that house? And I used the word over the threshold of the front door. And he said, I didn't say front door. But he didn't say no carried. But when he said, I didn't say no to the front door.
Cross-checking this against the case file, this is a real, checkable pattern in how officials handle unconfirmed physical details during an active investigation, neither lying nor confirming, but redirecting the specific wording of a question to avoid committing to a detail that hasn't been publicly released. It's a reasonable, standard investigative posture, not itself evidence of anything about the family. Banfield's read of it as evasive is accurate, but evasiveness about an entry point detail is a media management choice, not a signal pointing toward any specific suspect. The claim that started on February 3rd ran for nearly 2 weeks before law enforcement addressed it as directly as it ever would. The specific word choice here is worth sitting with. Cruel is a moral judgment, not an investigative one. Nanos isn't just saying the theory is incorrect. He's characterizing the act of reporting it as harmful and directing that characterization at the media broadly rather than at any single outlet by name. Cross-checking this against the case file, per multiple outlets reporting the same statement, Nanos specified the family had been cleared in the first few days of the investigation, meaning, if accurate, the clearance predates almost the entire 2 weeks of prime suspect coverage that followed Banfield's February 3rd report. The gap between an internal clearance decision and a public statement correcting the record is itself a real common pattern in active investigations. Officials often don't rebut every public claim in real time, but the length of this particular gap is part of why the theory had enough runway to cause the damage covered in the next round. The clearest answer to what happened to the report isn't about Sione at all. It's about someone the story was never supposed to touch. Evans had no connection to Nancy Guthrie at all. His only link to the case was having once played in a band with Sione, who had himself already been cleared. Per the New York Times' reporting, Evans spoke with investigators for roughly 40 minutes about a week into the case and was never contacted again, meaning law enforcement's own interest in him was resolved quickly and quietly, the opposite of how his name spread publicly. Cross-checking this against the case file, this is the clearest, most concrete answer available to the question in this video's title. The prime suspect report didn't stay contained to Sione, and it didn't end when Nanos cleared the family on February 16th. It kept propagating outward to people with progressively weaker and weaker actual connections to the case, arriving eventually at a school teacher whose only link was a shared hobby with someone who had already been publicly exonerated. A sheriff telling a private citizen to consult a libel attorney is, functionally, law enforcement acknowledging that media speculation had outrun any evidence it was built on, a claim delivered with its own built-in hedge. Maybe. The one case, named by the reporter herself, that should have been the warning. A piece of physical evidence raised in the very same interview that argued against the theory the interview was promoting. A sheriff who eventually used the word cruel 3 weeks and one uninvolved schoolteacher too late. And months on, a named journalist's flat rebuttal sitting next to an anonymous gossip claim that may or may not be true. So, what actually happened to the prime suspect report? Which of these 6 points answers that question best for you? Leave a comment below. I read everyone. And hit subscribe to see more analysis like this.